Now that we've seen how to connect to MongoDB from inside an Express application, the next thing that we're going to do is convert all of our get endpoints so that they load their data from MongoDB instead of using the in-memory data, right? The temp data file that we've been using so far. Alright, now the good news is that what we just saw in this hello endpoint as a demonstration is actually the exact way that you load all of the products from our database. So what we can do is replace the logic inside our products callback with what we had inside of our hello endpoint. And as a matter of fact, we can just delete our hello endpoint, for now, to save space since we are not using it anymore, right? That was just for demonstration purposes. So let's paste all of its contents inside our app. Get products callback. And one thing to notice is that you're going to have to add the async keyword to that callback, just like we did for our hello endpoint because we're using the await keyword inside of here. And now, as I said, we can delete the hello endpoint together just to keep our code clean. So now that we've converted our getProducts endpoint over to using MongoDB, we should be able to do pretty much the same thing for our cart endpoint, right? Our load cart endpoint and our get individual product endpoint. Although the exact implementation here is going to look a little bit different. So for our load cart endpoint, what we're going to want to do first is make a slight change to the path here to reflect the data change that we made in our database, right? Remember that instead of inserting our cart into a cart collection of some sort, we added a users collection, where the users themselves had a cart property that contained the product IDs they had in their cart. So what this is going to look like is we're going to change this from just /cart to /users/, and then we're going to use a URL parameter here called user_id/cart. So in other words, what this path is reflecting now is that we're loading a user by ID and getting the items in their cart. Alright? And you'll see why this is so beneficial when we move on to connecting our front end and back end. Alright, so anyway, now that we have this user ID, we can use that to load the corresponding user from the database and get the items in their cart. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say const user equals, and we're going to use that client thing again. And actually, we'll need to connect to it just like we did up above by saying await client. Connect. And then down here, we'll say const user equals await client.connect. Etc. And, oops, actually, we'll remove this const user thing and move that down to beneath where we have our database. So now, we can just say const user equals db. Collection, users, alright? And one thing that I don't think I've pointed out yet is that unlike in the Mongo shell, where we can just say db. Users, right? The name of the collection. In the MongoDB driver in an Express app, we have to actually say db. Collection, and pass the name of the collection as an argument. Alright, so anyway, we're going to say db. Collection, users.findOne. And we're going to want to find the user whose ID matches this user ID URL parameter. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say ID, and then, of course, we'll need to get the value of that user ID by saying request.params.userid, and that will give us the corresponding user. And one thing that we're also going to have to add is the await keyword before this since it's asynchronous. Make sure you don't forget that or you'll run into some strange errors. And we're also going to add the async keyword to this callback. Cool. So now that we have the user from our database, we're going to need to populate the user's shopping cart from the products collection in our database, alright? And that's going to be a little bit more difficult than what we were doing originally because what we're going to have to do is actually convert this populate cart IDs function from above into an asynchronous function. So let's find that function up here. We're going to say async function populate cart IDs. And what we're going to have to do here is change this to reflect that we're no longer working with just a basic in-memory array called products, we're going to have to actually find the corresponding product for each ID. Now, this is going to get a little bit confusing because we're going to be working with promises directly. So don't worry too much about the details, just know that this will work. So what we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to wrap this ID map thing in a call to promise.all, right? So, basically, this is going to wait for all of these operations to complete. And what that's going to look like is we're going to say is map, and we're going to map each ID to a call to MongoDB. Alright, so we're going to get that client in just the same way inside this function. Alright, so we say await client. Connect, and then we get the DB. And then inside here, we're going to say is map. And for each ID, we're going to say DB. Collection, products, find one, and we're going to find the product by that ID property, alright? And notice that we don't have to use await here because of this promise. All. Again, don't worry about the details here. This is a slightly confusing piece of code even for people who really know what they're doing. So what we're going to do is just leave it the way it is and use this populate card IDs helper function from now on. So now that we have that, all that we're going to need to do to populate our users' card IDs is add await. And then instead of passing cart items, we're going to say user.cartItems. Alright? Remember, that's where we stored the item IDs in our database. And now that we have the populated cart, we should be able to send that back to the user. So let's test this endpoint out now. We're going to want to send a GET request to /users/12345. Remember that that's the ID we gave to the user we inserted into the database, and then we're going to say /cart. And if we hit send now, what we should see, if everything goes well, is that the response will contain the two products that were in the user's cart. And another thing to notice is there's also this _ID property in addition to the regular ID property we added ourselves. That's just the random ID that MongoDB automatically assigns to things that we insert into it. So anyway, that's how to load data from MongoDB. As well as populate the card IDs using MongoDB. Alright, so we've added MongoDB to 2 of our 3 load endpoints. So the last thing that we're going to do here is see how to add MongoDB to our endpoint for loading individual product data. So what this is going to look like, it's going to be very similar to what we've seen elsewhere. We're going to start off by connecting to MongoDB and selecting the database. So I'm just going to copy those lines from our cart endpoint and paste them inside here. And then of course, we're also going to need to add the async keyword to our callback function. And now that we've done that, what we're going to do is after we get the product ID from the URL parameter, instead of finding the product in our array, which was the old way of doing things when we were still storing our database in a file, we're going to say const product equals and then we'll say await db.collections. And that's going to be product, and actually it's not db.collections, that's db.collection singular. And then what we're going to do is say .find one, and we're going to find the product whose ID matches the product ID URL parameter. And once we've done that, we should be able to send back our product to the client by just saying response.json product. So let's test this endpoint out now by sending a GET request to /products/123. And if we click send here, we should see, oops, so looks like we got null. And I believe that is because I put product instead of products, right? The name of our collection is products. So let's try that again. We're going to click send, and sure enough we see that the product with ID 123 is sent back as part of the response. Alright. So now that we've converted all 3 of our load endpoints over to use MongoDB, you're probably wondering if there's a slightly less repetitive way of connecting to MongoDB and getting a reference to our database. And the answer to that is yes. So what we can do is, instead of having to add these same 2 lines to each of our callbacks that we want to use MongoDB inside of, we can actually just connect to MongoDB when we set up our server. So what that's going to look like is we're going to surround all of our server-side code, right? All of the endpoints that we define, the app that we create, etc., with an asynchronous function that will call something like start, right? Or you could say execute, you could say serve, whatever you want to call it. And we're going to put all of our code inside of that, right? So that'll include, again, all of our endpoints as well as the app listen call, and we're going to paste those inside this function, and then we can adjust the indentation by selecting all of these and hitting tab. And actually this MongoDB stuff should be in there as well, so I'm going to copy that and put that up at the top of our function. And there we go. So now that all of this code is inside an asynchronous function, what we can do is just move these 2 lines outside of our endpoint so that we only connect to MongoDB once and get the reference to our database once and for all. So that allows us to remove these two lines from all of our endpoints down below. And what we can do is just take a look at all of those, right? Including this populate cart IDs async function, which we can just remove those two lines from. And we can also remove them from our load cart endpoint as well as our individual product endpoint. So let's try this again. What we're going to want to do is just make sure our server is running, first of all. And actually we see that it's not, right? We don't see the server is listening on port 8000. And that's because, well, we forgot to call this start function. So what we're going to want to do is scroll down to the bottom and say, start with parentheses after it. And that will make sure that our start function is actually called. Our server is created and set up and our app starts running. So sure enough, we see that once again, it says server is listening on port 8000. So let's go back to Postman and try sending a request to our, well, really any of those endpoints again, right? We should be able to send one to product/123. And sure enough, we see that we get the same result. And if we try and load all of our products as another example, we see that we get all of our products again, too. So anyway, that's how to make our MongoDB connection code less repetitive, is by connecting to it once inside this async function that we created. And then just using that connection in our endpoints instead of having to establish a new connection on each and every request. Alright, so now that we've converted our get endpoints over to use MongoDB and done a little bit of cleanup, we can now move on to converting some of our create endpoints over to MongoDB. And as a matter of fact, we only have one create endpoint. And that is the endpoint for adding items to a user's cart. So what we're going to want to do here is make the same sort of change where we add the new item ID to the user's cart. But obviously, this is going to be a little bit different because once again, we're changing the structure of the data we're working with, right? So just like up here, when we loaded the user's cart, we had to actually load the user and take a look at their cart items and use this populate cart IDs function. We're going to have to do a similar kind of thing down here. And the first thing that we're going to do actually is change the path to /users/user ID. That's going to be another UR parameter there /cart. Okay, and that will make it easier to find the user when we know their ID from the parameter there. So at the top here, we're going to get the user ID parameter value by saying const user ID equals request.params.user ID. And now that we have that, we're going to use the user ID to load the corresponding user and update their cart items property. So the way that we're going to update the user is by using a MongoDB method called update1. So very similar to how we were able to say find one, we're going to use update1 to update a single document in MongoDB. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say await db.collectionUsers. And by the way, in order to use await, we have to add async to this callback as well. And then we're going to say .update1. Now, the update1 method in MongoDB is a little bit different from some of the other methods because the other methods only take one argument, which is what's referred to as a filter object. And as we've seen, this filter object allows us to load only a product whose ID matches a given value. For example, so with update1, we have that same filter object as the first argument, right? We can say ID user ID, and that will find the user with that ID, but then it also takes a second argument, which is an object that specifies how we want to update the record that matches this filter. Alright, so what this second object looks like is it's going to have a property called $push and the value for that is going to be cart items. Well, an object that is with a property called cart items. And the value for that is going to be the new product ID we want to add to the user's cart. And what this is saying is that we want to push the product ID onto the user's cart items property. So this little $push thing just tells MongoDB what type of update we want to perform. In this case, we're adding the product ID onto an array called cart items. And there are other ones, by the way, as well. In fact, One that would be very useful for us if we want to avoid having duplicates in the shopping cart. We could change this push operator to $add to set. And what that does is something very similar to push, except it doesn't add duplicates. So if a user tries to add an item to their cart that was already in there, it's going to remain the same, right? It's not going to change. Alright, so that's just one example out of the many things you can do with MongoDB update queries. But this will add the product ID to the user's cart items without duplicates. So now that we've done that, right, the user should be updated in our database. So what we're going to do is load the user and send the user's updated cart items back to the client side. So what that's going to look like is we're going to, first of all, remove this cartitems.push thing since we're no longer doing things that way. And we're going to load the corresponding user and populate the user's cart IDs. And actually, this is the same logic as what we have up here where we load the cart in the first place. So if you want to, we can just copy this logic and paste it down here in our post endpoint instead of what we had before. So sure enough, we get the user, we populate the user's cart. We send that back to the client. So now that we have this endpoint updated, let's go back over to Postman and test this out. We're going to try and add an item to the user's cart by sending a post request to /users/12345, right? The fake user ID we came up with and put into our database. And then /cart. And we're going to add a body here with ID 234, and that should add the ID 234 to the user's shopping cart. So let's try this out. We're going to click send, and sure enough, what we'll see is that this new item will be at the bottom of our cart. And another thing to notice is that if we try and click send again, well, that's not going to add a duplicate because of the add to set operator that we were using in our code. So, alright, so if you want to test this out with other IDs, right, maybe we want to add item 456 to our cart. If you click send, you should see that that item will be added to our cart as well. And sure enough, there it is. So that's the basics of adding items to our cart using MongoDB. Alright, so the last endpoint that we're going to convert over to use MongoDB is going to be the endpoint for removing products from a user's cart. Now, this one's going to be pretty straightforward. And it's actually going to be very similar to the endpoint for adding items to the user's cart. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is change the path so that it reflects the updated data structure. Very similar to what we did with our app post endpoint and our app get cart endpoint. We're going to say /users/ and then the user ID whose cart we want to remove the item from. So, basically, what this path means is if we send, let's say, a request to /users/12345/cart/123. That would mean we want to remove product 123 from user 12345's account. Alright, so what this is going to look like is we're going to start off by getting the value of both the URL parameters from the path. And we're already getting the product ID. So let's also get the user ID by saying const user ID equals request.params.userid. And then we're going to use MongoDB's update1 method again, just like we did in the add to cart endpoint. Except what we're going to do is we're going to remove that product ID from the user's cart instead of adding the ID to the user's cart, like we did up in our add to cart endpoint. So, here's what this is going to look like. We're going to say await db.collection, users.update1. And you're probably seeing this little underline for await. We're going to add async to our callback function here, and that should get rid of it. And what we're going to want to do is update the user whose ID matches the user ID request parameter. And for the actual update object, what we're going to do is instead of saying add to set, we're going to say $pull. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell MongoDB that we want to remove an item from an array property. So what we're going to do is say $pull, and the property we're working on is cart items here. And we want to remove the product ID from that cart items array. So that should update the user accordingly. And once we've done that, we're going to want to do pretty much the same thing that we did up in our add to cart endpoint. We're going to load the updated user, populate the cart IDs, and send that populated cart back to the client side. So let's just replace the code at the bottom of our remove from cart endpoint with the bottom 3 lines of our add to cart endpoint. And now that we've done that, we should be able to test this out. So let's go back to Postman. And, well, let's start off by getting the cart first, just so we can see what our cart looks like. So we're going to send a GET request with no body to /users/12345/cart, click send. And we should see all of the products currently in our cart. So let's try just removing one of these by sending the correct request. Let's try removing product 345. So the correct request for that is going to be a delete request, sent to /users/12345/cart/345. Okay, and if we hit enter, sure enough, what we'll see is that 345 is no longer in there. And we're left with only 3 items in our cart. So that's how to convert the remove from cart endpoint over to use MongoDB. And at this point, we have all of our major endpoints converted to use MongoDB instead of an in-memory JavaScript array. So what we can actually do is just remove these cart items and products. And we can also remove this import since that's no longer used. And in fact, we can even go in and remove the tempdata.js file. So I'm just going to say delete permanently for that one and then delete. And that's all we need to do. So, at this point, our server is fully converted to use MongoDB.